Well, good evening. I'm Steve Target, Chair of the Program Committee of the Union League Legacy Foundation, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to tonight's Public Affairs program. The Legacy Foundation is a nonprofit charity of the Union League. We're guided by the United States Constitution and the history and values of the Union League. The foundation's goal is to create a more informed, more engaged citizen leader, and we do this through dozens of programs, lectures, scholarships, and exhibits, including programs like tonight's Public Affairs program. All of the programs of the Legacy Foundation are made possible through voluntary contributions from Union League members and others who share in our values. So thank you to all of you who have donated to making these programs possible. Tonight's program is going to run about an hour in length, and toward the end of the program, our guests will take questions from the audience. To ask a question, use the Q&A icon on the bottom of your screen. Feel free to ask questions at any time during the program, and we'll get to as many questions as possible. Now, it's my pleasure to introduce to you our moderator for tonight's program, the Executive Director of the Legacy Foundation, John Miko.
Thank you, Steve. And again, everyone, welcome. One other piece of business before we get into our program. For those of you who are attorneys who are watching and want CLE credit, we're happy to provide that for you with our partners, along with our partners at Buchanan Ingersoll. I will be giving the magic word, at the very end of the program. So you'll hear the word at the end of our program for your CLE credit. Our guest tonight is Henry Olsen. Olsen is with the Washington Post, and he's a columnist and senior fellow at the Ethics and Public Policy Center. He spent many years in the world of think tanks, including a stint as president of the Commonwealth Foundation right here in Pennsylvania. He's held positions at the Manhattan Institute, the National Research Initiative, and the American Enterprise Institute. And I just learned when I was reading your bio earlier, Henry, that you actually spent some time in Philadelphia practicing law for a short time as well. Mm-hmm. So welcome, Henry. We're very excited that you're with us this evening.
Well, thank you very much for having me. And I always would welcome a trip back to Philadelphia. In fact, I think first prize is 2 trips to Philadelphia. I'm glad that we can do this digitally, although we can't do it in person.
Well, and we're looking forward to having you back in Philly as soon as we are able. And we're thinking that might be very soon. So the future of the Republican Party is our subject this evening. But I thought before we talked about the future, we might talk a little bit about the past, and specifically, Henry, about the Republican Party and the conservative movement within that party, especially I would say the more recent, and you can define that as you would like, conservative movement within the party. What does that look like? How do we get to today, conservative movement within the Republican Party?
Well, to go back to the beginning is that in the 1950s, Dwight Eisenhower was president, and he was selling what he called modern republicanism, which was a philosophy that said, accept the New Deal and be internationalist in foreign policy. And Bill Buckley and others who called themselves conservatives disagreed with that. They thought there should be more of a focus on limiting and rolling back where possible the state, while being more muscular in being internationalist against communism. And what happened over the next 25 years was that movement conservatism, as Buckley's venture came to be known, gained more and more power within the Republican Party. And its most popular and effective proponent was Governor and then President Ronald Reagan. His election in 1980 really showed that the movement was something that could not be swept under the rug, which is what the establishment Republicans had wanted to do for decades. And so over the next 30 or so years, what happened was a growing identity of the conservative movement with the Republican Party. Moderates and liberals who were strong within the Republican Party in the 50s had largely left by the George W. Bush administration. And what you were left with was various strands of conservatives. Now, not all of them were movement conservatives, and that's something that the movement has always struggled with. They tend to think of the Republican Party as their wholly owned subsidiary. And in fact, as my work in the book, The Four Faces of the Republican Party, co-authored with political scientist Dante Scala, shows, that even today, the movement is a minority, a very large minority, but a minority within the Republican Party. But what had been a party that was largely the descendant of the Grand Army of the Republic, still in 1955, nearly 100 years after the Civil War, had by the era of Donald Trump largely become a conservative party with disputes settled between different types of conservatives rather than one that was a fully broad tent.
So one of the big players in this movement, I think you would agree, it would be CPAC, or a big moment every year would be CPAC. And Ronald Reagan had his moment there and many moments there.
Many.
And other conservatives did too. This past weekend, CPAC occurred. It didn't look much like a lot of other CPACs, even more recent, 4 years ago even, or 8 years ago, certainly. It looked like a totally different kind of group of people. What did you learn from CPAC this weekend, and how do you, is that a conservative conference this weekend?
Well, it always depends on what you mean by conservative. Even within movement conservatism, there's always been strains and emphases. By the pre-Trump era, movement conservatism at CPAC had largely come to be dominated by somewhat libertarians, people who were largely free market and against large government in their economics, but not radically enough so as to be politically untenable like the Libertarian Party is, and internationalists in global affairs. However, the election of Donald Trump, which the people at CPAC largely opposed in 2016, transformed their understanding. And under the leadership of Matt Schlapp, it has become effectively, at least this conference has been, a Trump cheerleading operation. So all of the panels and all of the speakers were designed to really not engender discussion or debate among various strands of conservatism, but rather operate as a 60-hour infomercial for both the people who are trying to become leaders of this, most of the leading contenders for the 2024 nominations vote, but below that level, make arguments for various strands of Donald Trump's personal preferences, including 6 panels on the myth of voter fraud, that the idea that the election was stolen, which it wasn't. So you look and you say there's an element of conservatism that's represented there because the people there are and would call themselves conservatives, but it is no longer, even within the movement, an entity that contains all of the multitudes of movement conservatisms. In this 2021 CPAC, it largely featured the friendly to Trump sycophantic wing of movement conservatism, which is to say a minority of a minority.
I want to get back to that kind of split that you referred to, but let's talk about Trump specifically and his support within the Republican Party. And you did a poll a few weeks ago and tried to get a handle on who were Trump's supporters. And what did that tell you? And what can you tell us about that?
Yeah, the poll was something that Ethics and Public Policy Center, in conjunction with the YouGov polling firm, conducted. I was the primary architect of the survey instrument, the questionnaire. And we asked self-selected Trump voters a wide variety of questions designed to get at both their thoughts on Trump personally, but more importantly, what do they think about public policy? What are they afraid of? What are they for? What are they against? And so what you learn is that, first of all, only about 70% of Trump's support comes from the old Republican Party. A quarter to 30% comes from people who voted for Barack Obama or voted for a third-party candidate in 2012. And those people are significantly more liberal on a lot of issues, although not on other issues, than the traditional Republicans. So the Trump coalition is different from the Republican Party. Within the Republican Party aspect that supports Trump, this is a group that is center-right on economics, but not massively anti-government. It is one that has many differences of opinion, but is uniformly conservative on cultural matters and is distinctly more Christian in their theology and in their practice than the country as a whole and the Obama-Trump voters who made their man a national figure.
All right, so now let's talk about there's a split there, right? You could get real differences and fundamental differences.
Fundamental differences.
What do you think? We'll get a little into the future now. What's going to happen here? Is this something that can hold together or not?
Well, yeah, it can hold together. It's really a question of how Republicans want to treat this coalition. If Republicans want to take the Trump coalition as a base and try and build on it, then what they will do is create a new economics that is firmly rooted in free enterprise and limited government, but that is much more open to government action than it had been pre-Trump, while also specifying and uniting around the cultural and foreign policy issues that largely unite the Obama-Trump voters with Republican voters, that both sets believe America is under threat, that its founding principles are in danger of being lost. They're largely pro-life. They are largely even more strongly in favor of protecting the police and supporting the police, in favor of the Second Amendment. There's different emphases, but there's unity there. And there's also a large unity on controlling immigration and being practical but internationalist in our foreign policy outlook. A large distrust of multilateral institutions, but a strong willingness to continue to be engaged in the world. So not wholly alien from the pre-Trump Republican Party, but not exactly a genetic clone either.
Can the Republicans do that with Trump himself? Can they do it with the personality of Trump? Whereas is the Wall Street Journal, and I'll get back to their article too today, said, do they have to abandon Trump? Trump, not necessarily the Trump supporters, but do they have to, and can that be done? How do they do that?
Well, it can be done I believe that the reason Donald Trump won the nomination in 2016 was because he alone understood where the gravity of concern and emphasis was among Republican primary voters, that they were no longer primarily motivated by the desire for small government, nor were they primarily motivated by the protection of traditional Christianity. There were large elements of voters who did prioritize that, but they voted for Ted Cruz. The majority of Republican primary voters were more interested in protecting them and their country from threats that they felt endangered by, whether that was competition from foreign economic powers, or whether it was fear of Muslim terrorism, or was concern about something else. And they wanted action. They didn't want inaction. And that's something that is very hard for the Republican establishment to accept. So consequently, my view is that if the Republican leaders who want to displace Trump are willing to be forceful in their advocacy for the set and collection of issues that Trump brought, many of them pre-Trump conservative, but many of them not pre-Trump conservative, then there will be a lot of people who will say, been there, done that. Thank you, President Trump. You had a good 4 years. You were unfairly treated, blah, blah, blah. But it's time to move on, because there's always been a large segment of people who liked Trump's policies, but were very uneasy with him as a person. And that's only been exacerbated by January 6th. Again, there's a very large segment of people who have always liked Trump's style, but there's a very large segment of the Trump voters who voted for him despite himself rather than because himself. And that means that there's a very good chance that a prudent Republican Party that adopts the new consensus of the Republican voter base can keep the party united without Donald Trump's personality.
So you talked about some of the things that the Trump voters believe in and are important to them, but who are they? Because these are not William F. Buckley people, right? So what do they look like? Where do they come from? And you referenced they were Obama supporters, many of them at one point. How do you characterize them from almost a demographic or other kind of perspective?
There's very different types of Trump voters. There are Trump was nominated as the candidate of the moderate and the center right of the Republican Party against the movement right. The movement right united under Cruz, but it's a minority of the Republican Party. His strongest support is now found on the movement right. And that's because he has become the choice of person for the evangelical Christian because of the tactical deal he made after he got the nomination and the way he committed and followed through on it. But when we add his personality into it, I think you've got a number of different groups. You've got the sort of person who agrees with Trump's general thrust and likes his personality. And that's a minority of the Republican Party, but maybe 20 to 30%. Then you've got people with different issue emphases who are largely in agreement. They came into Trumpism through different doors. And there you've got the Obama Trump voters who like his focus on the economy and his views on immigration and trade. You've got the religious conservatives who like what he said about that. You've got the people who like a strong but limited intervention in America, the sort of, that they like that he stands up to our enemies and he doesn't declare wars to conquer our enemies. And so you've got those people. And then you've got the people who are largely opposed to Trump. These tend to either be moderates or liberals, people who were always out of sorts with the conservative element of the Republican Party, who still struggle against that and also find Trump's personality unbearable. And a number of William F. Buckley types, to use your name, the sort of people who never cotton to Trump, really prioritize a small state or lower taxes. And they would like to see Trumpism and Trump removed. So in a sense, there's this alliance in the irreconcilables to Trump of people who disagree with Trumpism, but from different ways. That there's a group that disagrees with Trumpism and has always wanted to see a more centrist Republican Party, and a group that disagrees with Trumpism and wants it to move further to the right and abandon the moderation that Trump introduced in some policy areas. So it's very hard to see where, there's always multiple factions in any party. I've tried to give you a brief overview of them. Demographically, the party is overwhelmingly white, but the Obama-Trump voters are the least white portion of the party. The Obama-Trump voters have a large number of Latinos, Asians, and African Americans. And so it's largely white, but not as uniformly white. The traditional wings of the party are largely Christian, significantly, nearly half evangelical. 40% of the Obama-Trump voters have no religion at all. The traditional Republicans are found in the West and the South disproportionately. The Obama-Trump voters are found on the fringes of the South, the Hispanic communities in the South, but more significantly in the Midwest and the Northeast.
Let's talk about labor. And we've seen a shift, I think. And let's talk about the Democratic Party too, because everyone's competing for labor, which has traditionally been a Democratic stronghold for generations now. And do you believe we've seen a shift? And do you believe it has to do more than just Trump, from labor to the Republican Party, or do you disagree with that?
Well, I think we have to distinguish between organized labor and labor. Organized labor as a labor union, there is a distinction between private sector unions, which are the members of whom are more open to voting for Trump, and public sector union members are much less likely to support Trump. Demographically, one of the shifts in the Trump era is a massive influx of people who do not have four-year college degrees, and an exodus of people who do. Trump lost in 2020 because the balance of people who left were not fully outweighed by the balance of people who came in. Had he run as well in the suburbs in 2016 as he ran in 2020 as he ran in 2016, had he held on to some of those people in 2016 who didn't like him, but preferred Republican policies and held their nose and voted for Trump, those people voted for Biden this time more, and that's why he narrowly lost all these swing states. So I think a lot of it is due to Trump's courting of them, but it is not because they love Trump and no one else. They, in 2016 and 2018 and 2020, largely voted for Republicans. There is some of the I vote Trump for the president and Democrat everywhere else phenomena, just as there is some people who voted for Biden voted for Republicans at the bottom of the ticket, but largely they came into the party and voted for the party up and down the line. And that gives me hope that they can stay in a party which they have committed to in a way that the blue collar voters who voted for Ronald Reagan or Dwight Eisenhower were much less party focused initially. They often voted for the presidential candidate, occasionally for Republicans, but they did not immediately become Republicans. In the Trump era, that has become the defining factor. And that has something to do not just with Trump personally, but with the way the parties are lining up, that they don't see the Democratic Party as on their side, even though Joe Biden tried to convince them of that. He really did not have much success in doing that.
So let's talk about leadership, and who do you see lining up, so to speak, and what are their qualities? Who do they appeal to? And also let's talk about policies. What are the Republican policies moving forward? What will the Republicans stand for moving forward?
I think there's going to be a lot of debate about all of that. As far as the who is concerned, I divide it into three types of people: the imperial successors, the restorationists, and the young reformers. The imperial successors are people who will try and run almost explicitly as Donald Trump's heir, and they will interpret it in different ways. Some people will, like Don Jr., would almost certainly play up the confrontational style, whereas Mike Pence would play up the achievements and downplay the personal style. But they both will basically attempt to be the next coming of Donald Trump. The restorationists are the people who will pay lip service to the Trump era, but will basically try and restore the pre-Trump policy consensus. And you've got people like Kristi Noem or Ted Cruz. Well, Ted Cruz, is still trying to be the candidate of the movement conservative. You've got Nikki Haley, who's trying to be the candidate of the establishment conservative. And you've got Kristi Noem, who's trying to have a foot in both camps. We'll see where Ron DeSantis plays out. I suspect that he will try and be Kristi Noem and have a foot in both camps as well. Then you've got the young reformers, people like Josh Hawley and Tom Cotton and Marco Rubio, who are taking the substantive changes of Trump seriously and are advancing policies on economics that are that combination of populism and conservatism that would substantively go further than Trump did on his innovations. And I think it's way too early to say who will prevail. So much in politics is contingent on events, and personalities rise and drop with stunning rapidity. But I think those are the three camps that are emerging, and I think all of the new people who might come in will eventually be fitted into one of those three camps.
So some of those names, well, let's talk about January 6th. So there's a lot of baggage 6 weeks after that event, 7 weeks. Oh my gosh, it's almost 2 months. Is that baggage that's going to last for someone like, I'll just say Ted Cruz? Is that going to be with him, or can he overcome that? Or is that something that can help him?
I think it is different. It'll be different with different people. I think it's very difficult to see Ted Cruz or Josh Hawley becoming president of the United States as opposed to being the nominee. There is certainly if you look at the poll that I took, large majorities of Trump voters believe the election was stolen. A plurality of Trump voters would be more likely to vote for somebody who challenged the Electoral College vote and less likely to vote for a Republican in a primary for someone who certified it. It's not a majority, it's like 40%. That might fade, but it's certainly something that Trump is going to try and keep it from fading. So there's going to be people who Ted Cruz did not hurt himself among. In fact, he helped himself. Of course, the thing is, though, that the sort of person who likes that is also the sort of person who liked Ted Cruz 4 years ago. And the fact remains that movement conservatism is not large enough to win a Republican nomination without support of other factions. And that's where what Cruz did may cost him, that there may be some of those people who are more center-right, the somewhat conservative business conservative types, who will say, I wasn't crazy about Cruz to begin with, and this January 6th thing was over the top. You never want to say that something that happened in 2021 will be determinative in 2024, but I do think it's shaped some attitudes, and that whether the issue is live, the attitudes will be live, and that hinders people who are leaders, not necessarily just simply voters, but people who are leaders in the non-certification, the effort.
So 4 years ago, Republicans held the House, they held the Senate, of course, they held the presidency. Now they don't. The Wall Street Journal, some of those moderate business conservatives you just referenced, today, editorial called on Republicans to, quote, abandon Trump. And here's another quote: as long as Republicans focus on the grievances of the Trump past, they won't be a governing majority. Thoughts?
Yeah, I think that's largely right. You have to move on. The fact is Donald Trump lost. The fact is millions of people who would agree with many Republican policies found Trump too much to bear. There is no evidence that they have changed their mind after the election. If anything, January 6th have hardened them. And there will be people who, in November, who did not vote for Trump, but did not vote for a Democrat, who, if Trump were the nominee, would vote for a Democrat, because January 6th was crossing the line for those people. So I think they're right about that. I often disagree with the Journal editorial board because they are among the largest and most popular proponents of what I call the restorationists. Do they want to see significant changes on trade policy? Not really. Do they want to see real serious crackdown on immigration? Not really. Do they think that America should rethink its alliance structure so that it becomes less, so we don't engage in as much imperial overreach? Not really. I don't see any evidence that the Wall Street Journal editorial board has learned a thing about the state of the Republican Party in the last 4 years, but they are right about Donald Trump personally.
Well, and that's exactly what Trump actually railed against in his response to, as you can imagine, his response to the Journal. So in the Reagan kind of realigned the Republican Party into that conservative. You just went through several of the major, free markets, free trade, all those kind of fundamental conservative values, smaller government, which are now being challenged within the party itself. Where do you see, just a crystal ball, where do you see the party going in terms of their policy and values over the next couple of years?
The thing is that the Republican voters want limited but not small government. And if there's one question we asked that said, what comes closer, value comes closer to your own, protecting, making sure that Social Security benefits are the same, have the same value for future retirees as current retirees, even if the payroll tax went up, or controlling the cost of Social Security to all of us, even if it means benefits for future retirees might be cut. It was 63-37 in favor of keep the benefits the same, even if the taxes go up. On Medicare, we asked, which is more important, controlling the cost of Medicare to all of us, or ensuring that seniors get medical care they need regardless of the cost to us. 55-45 split. So there is no unity in the Trump coalition around smaller government. There is not a desire to see government as the solution to everything, or redistribution. So there's old values that remain. But as far as the idea that this is a group of people who are going to rally around, let's make government smaller, and free trade, those were 50-50 questions as well. As far as should we have more trade or less trade, roughly 50-50. 60% says foreign trade costs American jobs. Only 40% say it does not. So you've just got a very wide split. And if you try and go to free trade, open borders, amnesty in exchange for enforcement, but of course the enforcement is never serious, you can't even get a majority in the Republican Party for that. So what unites Republicans is the sense that government is not the answer, but neither is it the full enemy. And that America's culture, not religion per se, although religion plays into that, America's culture of ordered liberty is under assault from the left that wants to turn us into a woke socialist nation. That's where the unity comes from. And if a Republican Party wants to focus on economics and not downplay that, this is a Republican Party that is not going to win a majority because it will lose voters and not gain enough back of the old Romney voters who voted for Clinton and Biden.
So let's talk a little bit the economy, because the economy is, key to a lot of this, right? We have a good economy, you're going to have an incumbent that does well and a party that does well. You have a bad one, you're not going to do well. So we see trillions now, and it's going to be another 2 trillion here, 2 trillion there. What do you think about, and I think my personal opinion is this could happen pretty quickly. We see interest rates go up. We see things really turn on their head. And this is a terrible kind of opportunity to think of it that way for Republicans. But is there something there? Is that enough to make a difference in an election in 2 years? If this spending, it just kind of gets us in a bad spot in terms of just talk about interest rates and what the damage that could do.
Yeah, I actually think the danger to Democrats comes more from inflation, which is that, and I write about this all the time, including a piece I put out earlier this week. For all of the people who are out of work, because of the previous COVID bills, personal income as a whole has increased, not decreased, during the pandemic. Because of the restrictions, people have been saving that. People who are really hard off have been spending and keeping themselves afloat. But people have been getting money that they didn't need, so they've been socking it away in the banks. Saving rates are now higher than they've been at any time since World War II, when they were artificially pushed up because of wartime price controls and rationing. So, and now they want to throw $2 trillion into it. There's one thing when the price controls and the rationing came out in 1945 and 1946, what happened was inflation. When the 1946 election took place, inflation was running at 15% a year. And the Republicans took back Congress for the first time since 1930 because people were upset. So I think that that's where the likelier political angle is going to be, that if we get back to somewhat normal in the summertime, and all this money the Democrats have thrown out, starts getting spent the way they hope. It's a classic case of too much money chasing too few goods. And that means inflation. It means gas prices will go up. It means anything that's a fixed price or of limited supply will go up. Places where supply has been artificially suppressed will start to expand supply to meet demand, like airline travel. But a lot of the things people buy, you just can't raise cows quickly enough when you've got people with 15% more money than they had a year ago, and there's only 2% more cows. Beef will go up. So I think inflation is the big political angle for 2022 that could very well create a Republican, make spending viable. People react to government spending. When they're hurt, they want the government to hurt. When they're cutting back, they want the government to cut back. When they're fine with the government being fine. So I don't think interest rates would necessarily impact them, because it wouldn't, if they're looking good, the fact that the government is paying an extra $55 billion or $100 billion a year to service the debt won't immediately be felt, because surely the Democrats won't cut back spending in the near term in order to accommodate that rise in interest rates. But I do think inflation is a real possibility, and that would be directly tied to government spending.
Let me ask you a specific question about the voting bill that the House just passed. It's actually similar to one of I guess last Congress, and it calls for really far-reaching limits on what the state governments can do. And this is a political question as well as a legal question. But how do you think that's going to play politically within the American politic? What do you think is going to happen with that bill, and what's going to happen in the Senate with it?
If I were the Democrats, I would be very open to breaking that bill up. You have to decide. There's first of all, the bill would create massive incentives for voter fraud. And that was my column that got posted about an hour ago, explaining just, 800 words.
It wasn't a setup. I haven't even read it.
Yeah, you didn't even know. So this is a massive federalization of elections that's unprecedented. So one, from a political standpoint, I think it'll be very difficult for them to get it through Senate even if they had the 50 Democratic votes, in part because it's very easy to point to it and say, this could create fraud. This could create fraud. Why would Joe Manchin in a 30-point or 35-point Trump state anger his voters by enacting this bill? So one, I think as written, it's dead on arrival in the Senate. Secondly, if I were the Democrats, I would be very open to breaking it up and passing parts that I could get 50 votes for, which may not be the things progressive activists really want. So that creates a problem. Third, I think that legally, it is so unprecedented what it does with respect to the minutia in which it controls states. I could easily see a challenge going forth that this is too far, that this is too much. It violates the inherent state powers to conduct its own elections. And the Democrats are basically going to ask the Supreme Court to treat the elections clause the way they treat the commerce clause, which is to say that as long as Congress determines it has some rational basis to commerce, it can do anything it wants. As long as there can be some rational basis to the matter of elections, that they can do anything they want. I don't think a 6-3 Supreme Court is going to accept that argument. But of course, there are hundreds of special different clauses. They were very careful in writing this bill with severability clauses, so that if you find one thing unconstitutional, it doesn't get the other 299. If it were to pass, I think this would be litigated section by section in the courts for years to come.
So let's go to some questions, Henry, and I think we have quite a few of them. There are multiple factions in the Republican Party, as there are in the Democratic Party, but the question is, how do the differences among the factions get reconciled, and who leads that reconciliation? Is there a possibility that, quote, Reagan Republicans could be the mid-ground that sway moderate Democrats to move away from the growing progressive movement?
Well, I wrote a book. It's the red, white, and blue book in back of me, with a working class Republican, Ronald Reagan, and the return of blue collar conservatism. And my argument is that Reagan Republicanism has been misinterpreted over the last 40 years, is that the libertarian wing of the party grabbed Reagan as his own, when what he really was a conservative interpreter of Franklin Roosevelt. So if by Reagan Republicanism, you mean a Republicanism that extols the virtue of free trade, but like Ronald Reagan imposed quotas on Japan, which was then our trading adversary, 4 times because of what the Japanese were doing that was unfairly damaging American workers, well then yes, Reagan Republicanism can be the fulcrum. But
but isn't that specific example sounds a lot like China and Trump's approach?
That's why I mentioned it, is specifically to draw that illusion, which is that Ronald Reagan, at the height of the Cold War, ticked off one of our most important allies 4 times by restricting their ability to penetrate our market. Look, the reason we have transplant factories, Toyota and Nissan and Honda and Subaru in the United States, is because of a quota that the Reagan administration persuaded the Japanese to, unquote, air quotes, voluntarily adopt. And what it basically did was mean the way you get around it is if you ship the parts from Japan, but you manufacture in the United States. In other words, share the gains with American workers. That's why we've got those factories. So yes, if Reagan Republicanism allows for that, then Reagan Republicanism is basically a more thoughtful, more principled, cleaned up version of the Republican consensus. But if Reagan Republicanism is short speak for attacks on the state, fiscal austerity, government ought not to do anything, we're not going to get out of Afghanistan because if America leaves, it will destroy, it leaves anywhere, it will, forgetting that Ronald Reagan withdrew troops from Lebanon to no ill effect to the American alliance. I look at Afghanistan as being the equivalent of Lebanon. You went in, didn't work out, pull the troops out, reallocate them to a place where they can serve better goals. If Reagan Republicanism is that sort of Republicanism, that's not even a majority in the Republican Party. And this is one of the dilemmas in intellectual conservatism, is there's a lot of people who are that type of Reagan Republican and they want the party of their youth. But the thing is, the voters don't want the party of their youth. The American people don't want it. The Republican majority doesn't want it. You're a minority of a minority of a minority. And you either get along with people, or you decide to go and be irrelevant with the libertarians. And I think 2024 will be a year when those people largely decide, actually, I can live with this party because there's a lot I have in common with it.
So what is your take on the effectiveness and staying power of the Lincoln Project? And would you tell us what the Lincoln Project is? That question maybe a month ago would be more relevant, but go ahead and try it.
So what I'm going to do is I will give a sanitized version. The Lincoln Project is a super PAC which raised over $90 million. It was formed by 4 Republican campaign operatives and purported to be Republicans against Trump. And it ran ads not just against Trump, but against every Republican senator. And in fact, included receiving millions of dollars from Senator Chuck Schumer's Senate Majority PAC, we have now learned. It has now been thrown for a loop because one of its co-founders was discovered to have engaged in multiple years of inappropriate sexting with young men to try and basically trade job favors for sex. And the question has been who knew what and when. And it appears to me that the Lincoln Project is in the process of imploding. And even if it doesn't completely implode, its credibility has been completely shot because it didn't win. It didn't beat Trump. It didn't beat any of the Republican senators. And 2/3 of the money they raised went to the pockets of the founders in terms of paying consulting fees as opposed to buying ads. So between all of this, I think that, to paraphrase Charles Dickens, the Lincoln Project, whether it is alive in body, is in spirit deader than Jacob Marley.
So here's another question. And it's a media question.
Ooh.
How can the Republicans...
It's from the media or about the media?
I don't know who any of these are from, so,
okay.
But I doubt it's from the media. It's about the media. So how can the Republican Party be successful going forward in the face of an overtly biased mainstream media?
Same way it's always gone forward, which is find alternative ways of communication and be intelligent with how it engages with the mainstream media. The fact is the mainstream media still does put Republicans on television. It still does refer to Republicans in print. There are many more alternative forms of communication than existed even 20 years ago that Republicans can communicate with other Republicans and with potential swing voters that the mainstream media has no control over. While big tech has engaged in some canceling, deplatforming of conservatives, the vast majority of conservative speech is still carried. You can still buy it on Amazon. You can still read it on Twitter. So it's a worrying sign, but it has not yet been a significant dent. One thing to remember is that back in the early 1950s, William F. Buckley, the precocious 23-year-old, wrote a book attacking his alma mater called God and Man at Yale. There was only one publisher in the country that was willing to publish it. And because of that, they became the publisher du jour, or the publisher de facto, of conservative books. That's why Regnery Publishing is an empire among conservatives now, because when the entire mainstream publishing world didn't understand the market, Alfred Regnery did, and made a publishing empire that then has made conservative works available to millions of people. So yes, conservatives have been swimming upstream against the media for 70 years, and yet they've continued to grow and continue to have success in communicating their message. You have to be smart and clever about engaging it, and you have to also be assiduous about getting around their filters wherever possible.
Question: having won more votes than any incumbent president ever, you'll get back to that, I'm sure, and we'll put some context on, and lost an electoral vote by losing under 40,000 votes in 3 key states, Wisconsin, Georgia, Arizona, isn't the 2024 nomination Trump's to take if he wants?
General election statistics are not relevant to the primary. President Trump, if he wants it, will win the nomination if his standing remains where it is today. However, let's point out that in my poll of Trump supporters, only about 70% said they wanted Trump to run again. 30% of Trump supporters either said they didn't know or they weren't sure When you add in the Republicans who were not Trump supporters, that probably drops the total to 60%. CPAC's own straw poll, at a place that's basically stacked for Trump supporters, only 70% or so of them wanted Trump to run again. And then they did something I didn't do, which was they put a ballot test and said, okay, assuming Trump runs again, here's 11 different candidates. Who would you vote for? Trump only got 55% in CPAC, which was basically a 60-hour propaganda fest for Trump's personal preferences. So I think there is room for someone to say, and for Trump, for one, I think there's room for Trump to weaken himself. And I think there's room for other people who now can say, okay, I'm going to assume Trump's mantles without Trump's faults. So yes, if the election were held today, Trump would be the nominee, but the election isn't going to be starting to be held for 3 years. So let's see where Trump and the party stand in January of 2024 before we start giving him the keys to the nomination.
Question. Is there a future? And I'm going to paraphrase. Is there a future for moderates? Romney, Collins, in the Republican Party?
Absolutely there is, but not as a dominant role. First of all, Romney is not a moderate. Romney is a somewhat conservative, a centrist conservative. Collins
what's the difference?
Well, he shares a lot of conservative goals, but not 100%. And also prioritizes different things. That movement conservatives tend to prioritize either talking about social issues or religious issues, or tend to focus and prioritize shrinking the state. Romney doesn't prioritize. He doesn't have a problem with economy and government. He's not a let's expand government willy-nilly, but he's not a let's shrink government for its own sake person. He's sympathetic to religious, he's a religious man himself. He's sympathetic to traditional religion, but that's not what animates. He doesn't get up in the morning worrying that Christianity, that is, one person from Nebraska said to Ben Sass in his book, Them, said, this person's angry Sass in 2016 for not supporting Trump. He says, if Hillary Clinton gets in there, they'll be shooting Christians in the streets after a 6-3 Hillary court. That's not Mitt Romney's concern, but it is the concern of millions of religious movement conservatives. So that's why he's different. Collins is really a moderate. She goes back and forth between the parties in different things. She favors a larger role for government. I believe she's personally pro-choice, although she has supported some pro-life support court justices. The fact is that there are also different types of moderates. The Obama Trump voter, which is, again, the person who makes the Midwest competitive, the Latino voter who gave Trump Florida, and the Latino voter who almost unseated a Democratic congressman in the Rio Grande Valley, 50% of those people say they are liberal or moderate. If there is no place for moderates in the Republican Party, there is no place for the Republican Party to be a majority in the country.
So we had a program 2 weeks ago, I believe, on cancel culture. And that was you could say the theme, certainly was the headline at a lot of what happened at CPAC. Mm-hmm. It was right in there, right? That was on their banner, basically. That was.
Right. CPAC, conservatism uncanceled.
Right. So here's the question. Progressives push the, quote, cancel culture, which now seems rampant throughout our country and threatens the First Amendment. How much a threat are the progressives to the Republican Party, and what can Republicans do to push back? I'll rephrase that and say, give me your take on cancel culture, and what is the Republican Party the First Amendment party now in the face of cancel culture? Is that what
the Republican Party should make itself into the First Amendment party? And the Republican Party should recognize that the power of state and ultimately the federal government to protect the First Amendment is immense. That there is no reason why the federal government, right now, the federal government attaches strings to its aides so that, You have to, under Title IX of the Civil Rights Act, you have, starting decades ago, you had to promote women's sports in order to receive any federal funds, including student loans. There's no reason why conservatives can't put protecting the First Amendment and protecting freedom of speech as a condition on the receipt of federal aid. There's no reason why states like Texas can't actively move to eliminate cancel culture in the entities which it funds or controls. There's no reason at all for that. And they should aggressively pursue that. If you get into the question of private companies doing things that are private, then the question becomes civil rights law. That is, if you are forced to, as a condition of employment, believe in certain things and say certain things, that may not technically be a violation of the First Amendment, because the First Amendment only applies to state action, meaning something that the state directly or through one of its entities does. But it certainly violates First Amendment principles. And the question then becomes, if the courts don't hold that these things are protected already by the federal civil rights or state civil rights laws, there's nothing that stops Republicans from amending the laws to make sure that it does. So if you want to stop cancel culture, this is where the attitude towards government is important. You have to make the argument that it's not just words, it has to include law and action to use the power of the government to protect the most fundamental freedoms that we have.
Do you think people care?
The polls show right now that a small number of people care, and most people, it depends how you phrase it, that people don't yet, the mass of people don't yet know what the phrase cancel culture means. This is a political in-speak term. Now, a lot of people know, and it's more likely that conservatives know. People will care more people will care when they can see it directly or it becomes more pervasive. And that's increasingly what's happening. And there are ways in which Republicans can push back that raises the profile. Like why the Republicans are not introducing a bill that says no school district shall receive funds from the federal government if it renames a school that is named after a US president, a general in the United States, not Confederate, military, or a person who signed either the Declaration of Independence or the Constitution. Easy bill. Raises what San Francisco School Board did in trying to rename 48 schools, makes it an issue, says, we're going to defend America. And that raises, this fighting back raises the visibility of cancel culture. But right now, it's something that many conservatives know about, many conservatives are worried about. That's an important group of the Republican coalition. It is an important part of the American electorate, but it is not yet at the point where it is the issue that will make or break the general election.
So final question, and I think it's a question from our audience, but it's a good one to end on. I hope you'll answer it. What does the ticket look like that most would scare the Democrats the most in 4 years?
Yeah, so I'm not going to answer that question.
I thought you might not.
Yeah, no, but I'm going to explain why. Is that I'm almost 60. I'm a political nerd. I've been following elections since 1968. People come and people go. In 1967, George Romney looked like he was a leading candidate. One bad interview after he comes back from Vietnam and he's sunk. Nobody knows who Ronald Reagan is in September of 1964. By November of 1964, he's a conservative hero and people are thinking of him for president. Chris Christie was considered a front runner for the nomination after his re-election in 2013. By 2014, Bridgegate happened and he's an afterthought. So people come and people go. That's why I won't say names right now, because we don't know who will bear up. This is like forecasting who's going to hit at the major league level when people have only been hitting at the single A and double A. Running for president is sui generis. Some people rise to the occasion, and some people who you think should be good enough end up like Rick Perry, who starts with a poll lead and by 2 months later, can't remember the third government agency he says he will abolish on national television, and says oops to a question and dooms his chance of ever coming back. So you just don't know until they face major league pitching.
Fair enough, Henry. And this has been a lot of fun.
The one thing I will say
yes,
is there will be a woman on the ticket in 2024. I won't say what slot, and I won't say who. But if the Republican Party doesn't have a woman on the ticket, the Republican Party has a death wish.
okay, Henry, thank you. Really a lot of fun. We'll have you back up to Philadelphia in the Union League, I hope very soon. And I really appreciate it. Please, everyone, you should be reading Henry's column almost every day, Washington Post. Good stuff. Thank you so much. And we hope to see you back up here very soon.
I'd love to come back, and thank you for having me digitally today.
Great. Thank you again, Henry. So our upcoming programs, we have two really wonderful programs the next 2 weeks. Pat Toomey, Senator Pat Toomey, will be speaking next Tuesday, and on that's the 9th. And then that's a Liberty series. And then on the 24th, Michael Gerhardt will be speaking about Lincoln's mentors in a Civil War roundtable. One last piece of business for our lawyers who are looking for CLE credit. The word is future. CLE credit word is future. Remember, all of our programs you can find on YouTube. Just search Union League Legacy Foundation to watch any of our programs. And again, my thanks to Henry Olsen, and have a wonderful evening. Good night.